My name is Esther Armah. I am a journalist, a radio host, a playwright, a storyteller. I lead and love in this Black Star Nation.
3 a.m. on February 1966 in Accra, Ghana. My mother and 4 daughters, myself included, had all just traveled from London to Ghana. Soldiers with rifle butts start beating down the door. They shoot the doorman and they start firing at whoever comes into their path. They use those rifle butts to break every window and every door in the entire house. They come to my mother and the children, all of whom are screaming, and they put a gun to my mother's head. And they say, choose. One of your children is going to die tonight, choose. And my mother is trying to calm the children because the children are screaming. And the soldiers are drunk because they're so young, many of them have never handled guns before. And as they went to pull the trigger because she wouldn't choose, the soldier stumbled and didn't hit my mother. And somehow she got herself and her daughters out of the house that night. That night, up and down the street, there were beatings and rapings and killings and floggings. It was the night of the first military coup after the independence of Ghana in 1966. I have absolutely no memory of what I just said. The reason that I know that story is 30 years after it happened, my mother broke her silence for the first time and told that story. The reason why it shapes how I move through the world is that the silence of that day and my absence of memory of the actual event didn't change the fact that I had to live with the legacy of the trauma of that night that was untreated for 30 years. It interrupted the progress of my career. It interrupted the health of my relationships with other people, women and men. It kept showing up in ways that I didn't understand. And no amount of education shifted that. So what I learned was that you cannot PhD your way out of trauma. Yeah. It doesn't work. And what I learned was that we have compartmentalized this thing that is emotionality and nurtured our educational selves, nurtured our intellectual selves, nurtured our spiritual selves, and expected that somehow emotionality would just catch up with where you are intellectually, educationally, and that's how we move through the world. And yet it doesn't do that. Its power means that it will at some point come to interrupt, to paralyze, to stall, to install itself and to force you to pay attention. So for me, emotional justice became what I call an intimate revolution. That is, I want to change. How do I go from wants to willing? There's an ocean between those spaces. How do I negotiate with my resistance? It doesn't just start within, it comes from process. So we create policy that says violence against women is illegal. We create the policy that says that. And then we build platforms on which to issue calls to action that are about people understanding why it's dangerous and making a call to change. Emotional justice is about the process that you create to make that real for yourself and have that change for other people.
There is a consistent narrative about all the different ways in which you make black men deviant. And how many different ways, how many different ideologies, how many different labels can you create to make sure that you frame the conversation in that way? My other point, though, is that when you bring it all the way up to the contemporary time, is that ultimately what you're still dealing with, thinking about, talking about, is the legacy of untreated trauma. And what it creates in us, in how we feel about ourselves, and then how we deal with one another. So we talk about being a people of movements, and we talk about the importance of institutions. And I say, but the first and most significant institution is the institution of self. And so beyond the, it is not to negate the analysis and the intellect and placing everything in its context, but the legacy of that untreated trauma, I call it emotional justice. And that is that you have to deal with what all of those things have made you feel about yourself and how you shape yourself.
And there was a time when the ANC chose to engage in armed struggle, when they sent fighters to the Ghana of Kwame Nkrumah, when your father was in that government, to train there.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
The Mkonte Sizwe, Spirit of the Nation, is always framed as armed struggle. It is the resistance of a people to a government who are waging war against that people. And languaging it that way really matters. Because what happens when we think about Nelson Mandela, I call it the 3 Ls, lost, legacy, and leadership. And we start to language him in a way that separates the man and the movement in ways that are dangerous, because it implies that it is this magical space that he inhabits as an individual,
right,
as opposed to the institutional structures that framed him and really shaped who he became. We talk about a culture as if it's this kind of existential thing. And that culture doesn't acknowledge all the individual and different ways that people come to the table. So I'm somebody who walks with multiple identities. I was born in London, my family's Ghanaian, my mother is Ashanti, my father is Nzima. I carry all of those cultures within me. And the reason why they matter is I'm a journalist by trade who loves media with a passion, and I'm somebody who studied journalism and studied law. My father wrote and studied law, and so I've always believed I'm my father's child. But I'm of tribe, which is what African people are. And it was my mother who taught me, when I was a very young journalist, given my first opportunity to co-host. My mother's the one who challenged me and asked me, what is a co-host? What does a co-host do? And when I explained to her, over chopping onions in the kitchen in London, she told me that it is not your job to sit beside a man and look good. That is not your job. That is not a job. And so she said to me, what is it that you want to do? I said, well, I want to have my own show, and I want to do this, and I want to do that. She said, if you want to lead, lead. And that comes from a tribal space. My mother doesn't understand or know what feminist is. If you told her the word, she would laugh at you. And so it's about understanding that there were movements before yours that identified ways for women to be equal, and didn't call it the name that you called it, but had a way to breathe that. So for me, it's the marriage of all those cultures. It's the marriage of all those identities to create intimate revolutions in order to transform your world, in order to transform the world. And the same way that I have to take account of my culture and the things that make me up, I need to take account of the culture of the people that I work with in order for them to do the same. And part of moving towards a culture of care, I think, is expanding our notion of culture and paying closer attention to not just who's in the room, but how they show up in the room and how they can change what they do in order that we can change the world. Otherwise, we're in danger of creating platforms that are tributes to symbols, but don't do the substantive work that is negotiating your own resistance in order to transform.
That's good.